Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. Nancy, let's not start this fight with you. You know how much I love you, but your behavior makes me wonder about the legacy. What are you and Noah supposed to get? Mason pounded the table and fixed his cold gaze on his daughter. She kept her eyes averted from her father's dark abyss and tried to stand her ground, lest she show weakness. She had become so confident in her 25 years that even the family sometimes obeyed this young person. Don't you dare talk to me about money. I don't want it from you, or Grandma, or Noah. You're making me do something I don't want to do. The blonde girl who had tried so desperately to stand up to her father spoke through her teeth. You can never force me to work for your company. The Smith family is one of the most powerful in Street Petersburg. And all credit to Smith for building his empire so hard over the years. He's dead now, but his children and his wife, who owns most of the stock in the business. Molly was always sweet to her grandchildren and her sons, even though they visited her quite infrequently. She lived alone and felt homesick for her family, but never disturbed her children for nothing, knowing they already had families of their own. I'll send you to your grandmother to settle down, Lisa, Mason said, and left the table. Two pairs of eyes stared in surprise, and the third looked at her father fiercely through the doorway. Nancy clutched the edge of the tablecloth, which had been perfectly laid out as early as this morning. A rough hand lay on the back of Nancy's palm, and she slowly raised her eyes to her brother. You know that no matter what happens, I will always be on your side. Noah moved closer to his sister, and Tanya said, I'd actually be happy to run away from this damned house to somewhere in England or Italy. As long as our father's alive, he'll never let us out of his clutches, which I'm sick of. He's cutting off my air with his surveillance. Nancy ventured, as if not noticing her mother beside her, who looked so sadly at the children. Don't say that about your father, dear. You know he cares for us, Cindy said, and lowered her eyes to the floor. Many people had admired this woman in her day. They were amazed that she could conquer Smith himself. She had fought everyone with her unearthly beauty, her snow-white skin, eyes as black as coal, and incredibly golden curly hair. The twins Nancy and Noah probably looked more like their mother than their father. Cindy was a quiet but very commanding and elegant woman, until her children grew up. Mom, at least stay out of it. I should have stayed out of it when my father forced me into medical school, Nancy muttered, turning to his mother over his shoulder, defending her husband all you want. But he won't stop being a tyrant in my eyes. Your family is suffocating me. Noah shook his sister's hand again, hoping she would pull herself together. The two of them had an insanely strong bond. They were born on the same day and had been together for the entire 9 months they were in their mother's womb. Even though they were completely different, neither of them seemed to be able to exist separately. Nancy was like a time bomb, and Noah was the one who could save the world from that bomb. He was quiet and calm, and she couldn't stand inhibitions and crumbled every boundary she could. The Smith brother and sister were often caught in the lens of journalist cameras, and the internet dubbed them the perfect twins. Both have fair skin and golden hair, passed down to their mother. Their main feature is their hetero temple, which is quite interestingly placed in their eyes. Nancy's right eye was green and her left blue, while Noah's was exactly the opposite. They were loved by the press for never being stilted, being real, no matter the situation. Do you want James to take over the company when Grandma dies? Cindy blurted out, squinting at her children. She truly didn't understand Nancy's outrage, for she thought that such a life was quite normal. Cindy hated James Smith, her husband's younger brother, with all her heart and soul. And no one over the years had ever understood why this hatred was expressed. Nancy was already seething with anger when Noah was at that moment trying to keep her rage in check. We don't care about the inheritance. When will you realize? Noah said with sharpness in his voice, and then immediately changed his anger into mercy. Mom, we're sick of your sharing. Nancy lost her temper and, drinking a glass of juice, jumped up from her seat and walked away. And her brother, throwing a disapproving glance at her mother, followed her sister, living under the same roof as their parents. At that age, the boys thought it was unseemly, but there was nothing they could do about it. They were completely dependent on their father. And when one of them tried to get a job outside the family company, Mason made sure it didn't happen. It put a strain on Nancy's creative nature, and Noah only wanted his sister to be happy. She secretly drew gorgeous paintings, and in a city like St. Petersburg, she could have developed her creative side. But unfortunately, it was off limits to her. Cindy was left all alone, looking after the departing children. She hadn't been feeling well lately, but she tried not to show it. In front of the family, "Cindy, are you okay?" Mason approached the woman, placing his large palm on his wife's shoulder. "You look pale." Cindy lowered her eyes and took a deep breath to hold back the flood of tears that accumulated in the corners of her eyes. "I just don't want you all fighting, Mason," the blonde said, and shook her head gravely. It was getting harder and harder for her to hide her poor state of mind. "I want happiness for our family, and you know it. As soon as Molly loses her stock, everything will fall into place," the man said, and kissed his wife on the temple. He was really worried about her, just not as much as he was worried about the inheritance and the business. Smith only smiled warmly and stood up from the table, taking her husband by the forearm. They walked out of the dining room together, again discussing Mason's father's will. Noah squeezed 170 on the speedometer, turning down the main street of the town. Nancy, sitting next to him, nodded occasionally, but only with joy and adrenaline. Such trips gave them vitality. "Whoa!" Nancy shouted as the speeding Noah parked near a small bar. "No one is better at driving than you." The guy smiled and turned off the engine of his brand new Mercedes. The craving for cars was since childhood, and he dreamed of becoming a famous racer. But as practice has shown, all parents of twins want to do is crush their children's dreams as much as possible. "I want to go to the track. I want to feel that adrenaline. It's already at 220. You know, Nancy?" Noah asked, glancing at his sister. She obviously understood him, knew what her twin wanted, but unfortunately there was nothing she could do. The father was going through oxygen in every way possible so that the children would end up being what he wanted them to be. "I'm gonna get us our freedom." "Noah, you have my word," Nancy said firmly and held out her hand to her brother. They performed some secret action and smiled at each other. The guy had confidence in his sister and knew that she would still try to get her way. "And now I ran to Sofia. Didn't you miss me?" She poked her brother briefly on the cheek and jumped out of the car so fast he didn't have time to blink an eye. Noah slowly leaned back against the headrests and stared up at the ceiling of the car. His inaction gnawed at him. His sister had always tried, fought with his father, and had even often been punished for it. And he stood back and watched Nancy seek justice. He didn't know what his father's problem was or why he was so desperate to pass his company to them after his death. Inspired by his thoughts, Noah decided to drive to someone who knew exactly the answers to these questions. He started the engine and drove out of the parking lot with a squeal of tires. "Good afternoon, Grandma." He stood on the doorstep of Molly's house and hugged her happily when she asked him to come in. "You've been visiting me more often, Noah. I'm glad." The old woman slowly stroked her grandson's head and began to make tea. "I see you are alone for a reason. You are usually always with your other half." Granny called her grandson and granddaughter indivisible, so she was surprised that only one twin appeared. "I have some questions, for I know you probably won't answer them, but you can help Nancy and I to free ourselves from Father's onslaught," Noah muttered, wanting to know everything that could help him. "I take it that Mason won't stop as much as James." Molly sighed heavily and set a cup of tea and candy in front of her grandson before sitting down next to him. "You still don't know why the brothers aren't communicating and what the problem is with their behavior." Noah shook his head negatively and took a sip of the tea that his grandmother had kindly prepared. He fixed his gaze on the old lady and waited for her story. "You know that your grandfather loved his children madly, but they did not share this paternal love. Mason hated his father's commands and always tried to go against his wishes. James, on the contrary, always tried to please him in order to earn praise. But already more conscious in age, he began to do it not for love and praise, but for money. That your grandfather had. Noah listened attentively to his grandmother. In his will it was stated that after his death, his sons would receive only 15% of the shares, and the remaining 60 shares would go to me. But once my time came, the remaining percentage would go to the son whose children were ready to receive the company and whose children loved their father. That was a prerequisite. And really, I don't even know how that could be notarized. I mean, Dad's trying to make us the best. Compared to Liam and Charles. Noah asked, looking at Molly confused. He wants him to have the company. And James is trying to do the same thing. They're waiting for me to die so they can divide their inheritance, Grandma said, her head down sadly. And you're still young, Grandma. Noah sweetly put his arm around her shoulders and kissed her on the top of her head, which was covered with gray strands of hair. They're too busy with work and power to remember that you're their mother. Molly answered nothing, only stroked her grandson's hand and shook her head. She knew her children were too fond of competing with each other, so she expected a cold war to break out between her children and grandchildren as soon as her will went into effect. She had long ago realized that her sons only cared about their inheritance, not their own mother's health. Noah chatted with his grandmother some more and hurried to pick Nancy up from the bar to tell her the news of the inheritance and the war between his father and uncle. Holy shit, did you ever manage to break even? Shrieked Noah, trying to lift his sister off the bar table. Where's that Kelly of yours? Are you here alone? Don't worry, sweetie, I'm here. Turning around, Noah met his gaze with eyes as blue as the ocean. Kelly slowly ran her eyes along the stretched out from her friend's brother's body and occasionally raised her eyebrows admiringly. And you are, I take it, the praised Noah. What meeting? Rang out behind Noah's back, and he immediately clamped his jaws shut with anger. Fury filled this harmless guy, and he knew very well who was behind him. He whispered quietly, "Black Mercedes. Take Nancy and wait for me in the car." Nick handed the car keys to Nastya too, and she nodded apprehensively and left the bar, taking her friend under her arm. "And I wanted to say hello to my sister," said the guy, hugging Noah. "How did you go?" "You asshole," Noah growled through gritted teeth, glaring at his uninvited companion. "Noah, we're brothers, aren't we?" It was Liam, James's son, whom Noah hated after he stole a girl right out from under his nose. "If you're still mad about Alina, forget it. She's not my type anymore." Noah clenched his fists and, unable to stand his aggression, punched his cousin in the nose. Liam came in from behind, throwing his head around, blood combining from his nose. "You'll pay for this, bad man," issued Liam, and hurried out of the establishment. "That wench that was with you will soon be mine." Gathering his emotions, Noah got out and hurried to his sister and her friend. Nancy sat in the back seat and grumbled something inaudible, while Kelly tried to wipe her face with a cold, wet washcloth. "She can't go home like that, can she?" Kelly asked, looking at Noah's face. She noticed a strange red spot on his forehead and wrinkled her nose. "Are you all right? Can she stay at your place?" asked Noah. He didn't pay attention to the girl's last question. He was really worried about his sister and how his father would react to her drunken coming home. Kelly nodded and made herself comfortable. "Sit up front, you'll be leading the way." The girl was surprised, but followed the edict and sat forward. They rode in absolute silence. Noah was still angry about the encounter and angry at himself for not being able to keep his temper. He involuntarily squeezed the gas pedal, and the speedometer barred, overturning the number 190. Kelly squirmed in her seat and, without noticing it herself, clutched at Noah's hand that rested on the gearbox. This phrase sweetened the guy, and he, afraid for the girl, braked sharply. "Are you all right? I scared you." Turning his body towards the girl, Noah asked. Kelly's brown hair stuck to her eyes from the harsh braking, and she slowly turned her face towards the guy. That was actually pretty cool, she smiled, and noticing her hand on Noah's, gave it a quick tug. I can take you for a ride on an abandoned highway outside of town, Noah said with interest, and a quiet snore sounded in the back seat. But first we have to drive this little piggy to get her to call off. The girl smiled and gave him a nervous glance. She obviously liked him. They quickly made their way to Kelly's apartment, and after putting Nancy down, Noah and Kelly got back in the car. So, is Kelly ready? Noah asked, giving the girl an enthusiastic look. She nodded and said, "Can you call me Kelly? I don't really like my full name." They raced through the city streets with the music on full blast, which the girl joined in. They both seemed to be so immersed in the atmosphere that nothing and no one else bothered them. Driving out of town, he didn't stop at the makeshift start line and turned to the girl who was sitting so relaxed next to him. "Have you known Nancy long?" he asked, examining Kelly's face. Her eyes shone even in the dark. Her skin glistened, and were her lips red with coconut. "We met in medical school, socializing, but when we graduated, we started to bond." She sighed heavily. "I like her. Warm and open personality. Reminds me of my sister." "Where's your sister?" Noah's eyes were still on Kelly. "Dead," Kelly answered with a tremor in her voice and exhaled. Once again, a nervous lump formed in her throat. I'm sorry. I wouldn't have brought it up if I had known," Noah stated, lowering his eyes. The girl nodded, and to distract herself, Noah went back to the wheel and pressed the gas pedal a few times to get a feel for the car. "Come on, baby, show me what you can do," whispered the guy, and shifting the speed, rushed forward. With every second, the speed increased. The adrenaline in her blood jumped to an incredible figure, and her heart clenched with fear and pleasure at the same time. Kelly smiled through her apprehension and felt the warmth spill over her body. When the speed reached the maximum, they were flying 220 kilometers per hour on a smooth dark road, which was illuminated only by headlights. This inexpressible sensation filled them both from head to toe. Noah braked and sideways entered the corner, and then with a squeal of tires stopped. "How's that? Smiling at 32?" asked Noah, looking over at the girl. She sat motionless, not taking her eyes off the road ahead, as if she were in a trance from which she didn't want to come out. "It's divine. I want to be like this too." She was breathing heavily, trying to suck in all the air around her. "I'll teach you only next time you're sober." The guy smirked and squeezed the gas pedal again. In the morning, Nancy woke up with a throbbing in her temples and a pressure in the top of her head. Upon getting out of bed, she grabbed her head and gave a frustrated howl at how hard it was for her to just get up. Looking around, she realized she was at Kelly's. But that's how she found herself here. Memory was completely unwilling to prompt Kelly. Shouted Nancy, and then regretted that she had hurt herself unpleasantly with her own voice. A girl entered the room, holding a glass of water and a pill. Grinning, she threw the medicine into the water and held out the glass to her friend. Greedily, she sipped into the glass. Nancy frowned and tried to remember what had happened yesterday. But all in vain. "Why am I here, and how did this happen?" asked Nancy, pulling her cell phone out of the back pocket of her jeans. She hated sleeping in clothes that were outside, but apparently it hadn't really bothered her last night. "You've had quite a bit too much to drink. Noah said you can't go home in that condition, so we brought you to my place. Do you mind?" said Kelly, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Nancy was surprised that Noah was so comfortable leaving her to spend the night with a girl he didn't know at all. Her brother didn't usually leave Nancy alone. They often fought over Noah's overprotective behavior, but here he brought her to a stranger's house and left her there. The girls chatted and later went into the kitchen to have breakfast. Liam Smith was the bad boy in school and in adulthood. James had spent his entire adult life trying to make everything better than his older brother. and that even applied to parenting. He tried to give his sons the best education, values, and a good life. But it turned out they didn't appreciate it at all. Charles, being the older brother, wanted to take over the business after his father died. And that was his only dream. He had no respect for his father and mother and never thought about having a family of his own. All he cared about was money, honor, and power. Liam, on the other hand, was a shadow of his brother, and so he always wanted to get his father's attention with his foolish acts that got him into trouble. You can never reach the heights of Dimitri. Don't even think about me giving you the opportunity to work in our holding company, James blurted out, slapping his hand on the wooden surface of the table. You can't even leave the house without getting into trouble. Liam looked embarrassed, tweaking his recently broken nose with his index finger. He stood in his father's office, eyes downcast, listening to the lecture. But at least, this was how he was getting his parents' attention. He couldn't get it through intelligence, work, or good deeds. James only saw the bad in his son. And you're always silent like a rag. Get out, James shouted and sat down in his chair, staring at the papers on his desk. Smith silently turned around and walked out, slamming the door loudly. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he held himself back and made his way to his older brother's room. How are you doing? Daddy's little boy opens the door, Liam said right off his foot. He appeared, having seen the perfect cleanliness of Charles's room. Thick books adorned the wooden shelves on the gray walls of the room, an evenly made bed, and a minimalist style that made Liam sick to his stomach. He thought it was too perfect, and it annoyed him. Do you know what personal space is? No knocking. A gruff voice answered from the corner of the room. Charles sat in a lined black suit, typing something at her laptop. Liam's lip twitched. I haven't been taught. I'm so bad compared to you, Pro, growled Smith Jr. as he approached his brother. The latter, without thinking for long, rose from his seat and towered over his brother. He was taller, lighter, by about half a head, and that gave him the advantage of looking down on the other, as if he were really unworthy of him. Yes, you're bad, and you've made that reputation for yourself. Don't blame me for your stupidity, Liam. Then he was cold and imperious. But Liam wouldn't give in. He didn't like to show weakness, but he loved his brother as much as he hated him. You're the good one who makes me so bad. It's your choice. Charles gave him a nervous glance, then, adjusting his tie, pointed a finger at the door. Now go, you can complain to your mother. How insignificant do you think I am, brother? Liam's eyes poured with blood and fury. John clenched his fists. He couldn't hit his brother, but the rising anger beckoned to paint that perfect face with a few abrasions. Lingering, he left his brother's bedroom and walked down to the first floor and went to the gym. It helped him relieve stress and knock out all the hatred he had for his brother and father. James arrived at the office and decided to visit his favorite brother before heading to his office. Apparently, the hatred between the Smith brothers is something bloody. Hello, Mason. James entered the glass room and sat down in the chair directly across from his brother. A smile stretched across the man's face, and he looked at Mason contentedly. Hello, brother. The last word was spoken with a note of snarkiness and a chuckle, which caused James to smile even wider. What brings you to me? We don't seem to have any common projects this month. I want to talk about what's in store for us soon. James put his elbows down on the edge of the table and moved forward. Mom is 60%. You underestimate the tenacity of our mother. She'll outlive you, too. The man grinned, adjusting his collar. He felt a little stuffy. When it came to the inheritance and his unloved mother, I can expedite the process on one condition. Mason's eyes widened. I will help our mother finish as soon as possible, and you will not claim the inheritance. What's my benefit if I don't get that interest? Smith Sr. asked with interest, trying to figure out his brother's secret. I'll give you 20%. By doing so, you will have enough shares to provide for your family for the rest of your life, James concluded, and there was a persistent knock on the door. Both men tensed, and Mason allowed entry. Noah entered the office, glaring angrily at his uncle sitting across from his father. The dislike for James had formed back in the twins' distant childhood, and no one, much like Cindy, knew exactly why. "Son, is something wrong?" Mason asked excitedly. Noah nodded imperceptibly toward his uncle, and his father understood. "James, come on. Let's make a deal. We'll solve our problem at lunch." James winked at his brother and hurried out, leaving his son alone with his father. "I want to renounce your inheritance at the notary's office soon," Noah said in one breath. And Mason jumped up. "Are you crazy? What are you talking about?" The shout echoed throughout the office, causing the staff passing the principal to stand up and look in surprise inside the room. Realizing that this was not something worth watching, they moved on. "I don't want your money or your company or anything. You can leave me. If you want to deprive me of what I have now, I'll go ahead and earn it myself." Noah's voice was quite firm, which made his father raise his eyebrows in surprise. Mason knew that Nancy was always combative and easily got into arguments when she knew she was right. But Noah was calmer. But now he was proving that he was indeed a man willing to fight for what was right. "Son, if this is about the last fight with your sister, I said it out of temper," Smith Sr. said excitedly, looking at his son. "I don't want anything to do with the family business." "I'm sure," said Noah. "I'll write a waiver and we'll go to the notary tomorrow." "I've said all that." The boy left his father's office and headed for the exit with quick steps until he heard a rather interesting conversation nearby. "Are you and the boys? Are you taking her into the woods? She won't survive there. How will the police start looking for her? She'll be dead already," a familiar voice said. Noah came closer and noticed his uncle, covering his mouth in surprise. He quickly turned on the voice recorder on his phone and listened further. "Molly should be dead by the beginning of next month. You will do everything I say, and then I will deal with her myself." James finished and hung up. Noah disconnected, saved the recording, and immediately hurried to the car. James turned around and noticed the familiar blonde head that was running so hurriedly to the exit. Strange and even scary thoughts were turning in his head. He urgently needed to report this to Nancy, and together they would decide what to do about it. Arriving at the commission, he rang the doorbell, and the girl, surprised, let him in. "Is Nancy at your place?" asked an excited Smith, looking around at the acquaintance he had had such a good time with. The girl nodded and led the boy into the kitchen. His twin sister sat casually drinking tea, not even realizing what news her brother had rushed in with. "I have very bad news," Noah said, and sat down across from his sister. He cast meaningful glances at Aniston, as if asking if she could be trusted. It was as if she had read his mind and was about to leave. As Nancy called out to her, "She could be trusted. She won't give Noah a crap," a still unhealthy Nancy said, and stared at her brother. But what was the matter? In a hurry, the boy told all he'd heard and what he'd been doing at his father's company. The girls looked at Noah with open mouths and wide open eyes. Kelly, though she had no idea what was going on, was shocked at the cruelty of a man she didn't know. "We need to go to Marlowe," Noah assured her, not taking his eyes off his sister's friend. "What's been cooking dinner already?" After that strange story, "Is this your friend who works for the police?" Nancy asked, wiping her palms on the sides of her jeans. The blonde nodded and fell back into his thoughts. They had found out things they shouldn't have known, but they couldn't let their uncle get away with threatening their grandmother's life. Noah frantically dialed the number of Jacob, whom he had met at one of the races years ago. The first time he'd gone out, they'd started chatting, and after a while Jacob had become a cop, and he'd had no time at all for riding around town and racing illegally. But they'd meet occasionally, drink whiskey, and talk about life and the past. "Jacob, hey, I have an urgent non-phone call," Noah said, and then said goodbye and hung up. And Nancy frowned. She was afraid he'd said no, but Noah assured her they could talk to him tomorrow. "And if you tell your father," Kelly reprimanded, cutting the potatoes into large chunks. She turned to the boys and shrieked sharply. Blood started coming from her finger, and the knife fell on her foot, catching her ankle. Noah jumped up from his seat and instantly flew over to the girl, grabbing her arm. "Are you okay?" The guy examined the toe. "We need to treat it right away. The cut is deep." Kelly laughed and grabbed a tissue and applied it to the wound. "I'm a failed medic, aren't I?" "It's okay. I'm working." The guy's eyes traveled down to the girl's legs and ankle too. Nancy squinted at the moose and began to examine him with interest. He brought his eyebrows down to the bridge of his nose and looked at his sister judgmentally. "So what about the father?" Kelly asked again, while she worked on her toe. Nancy was applying ointment to her foot at the time. "He doesn't like his mother, and neither does James. I don't know what might come of it, but that's the last person I'd tell," Noah said, still excited. "So we should get home. You change the bandages in a while, dear," Nancy concluded and started to get up from the table. "I'll get my purse and we can go." Noah and Kelly were left alone, looking at each other in confusion. Determined to speak, they said at one point, "How about it?" A resounding laugh echoed throughout the kitchen. Kelly lowered her head in embarrassment and allowed the guy to continue with the first one. "I was going to say maybe we could go to that track again tonight. I'd offer to take you driving, give it a try, but you're a little out of shape," Noah stated, not taking his eyes off her bright blue ones. "I'd only be happy to come pick me up at 9. Noah nodded and smiled so radiantly that Kelly herself stretched out in a smile so wide you could see all 32 teeth. Nancy entered the room and kissed her friend on the cheek, pulling her brother up by his sweater to go home. Liam, meanwhile, lay on his bed, occasionally glancing at his phone. He was waiting for some kind of message, just to be needed. He suffered from loneliness, and his promiscuous sexual encounters for 7 years had not brought Noah any pleasure. His dream was the love of his parents and a family, which he felt he never had. A quiet knock sounded at the door, and his father entered the room, still the same stern, cold man, and Liam was already tuning in for another lecture on his behavior. "How are you, son?" A bunch of questions popped into Liam's head. James had never called him son. From the moment he turned 10, unpleasant memories popped into his head, and he clenched his jaws so they could set things off perfectly. His voice was detached, and his father noticed it. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, he was silent for a long time, as if tuning into a conversation that should have happened long ago. He, too, wanted to express his pain about his son, but decided it wouldn't be today. "I have one important favor to ask of you." Smith Sr. Liam's eyes were full of hope for a father's love, but in an instant they faded, and he stared at the man again as if he were a complete stranger to him. "I know you won't be with Noel. I'm going to ask you to do something, and in return you'll get a share in the company you'll run after I die." Liam swallowed and raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I'm listening, Father." Nancy, upon arriving home, flopped into bed and shivered almost as soon as she lowered her face onto the pillow. Noah shook his head unhappily and, leaving his sister's bag on the chair next to the bed, left her room. The living room was where their mother usually spent her time. There was a sound, the clinking of dishes, and Noah, not thinking long, rushed there. Mason was leaning over Cindy, who was trying to pick up the shards from the glass, and whispered something in her ear. "Mom, are you okay?" Noah asked, coming closer. His mom was sitting on the floor in a half-bent state. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking with splinters in them. "I'll help you." Noah began to pick up the glass, and a maid came into the room that also quickly started cleaning up. Mason helped his wife up onto the couch, and his son and father sat on either side of the woman. "Mom, you've been very pale for some time now. Are you sure you're all right?" the boy asked, taking his mother's hand in his own. Her skin was cold, and the veins on the back of her palm deflated. "Cindy, tell me." Mason's voice, next to his wife's, seemed almost velvety. He spoke to her as gently as he could afford. "Let's go to the hospital tomorrow. I don't like your condition. I'm fine. I'm not eating well. That's why I'm pale. I'm fine. Her voice was faintly audible, and the men clearly didn't believe it, but left her with the questioning, "Where's the starfish?" The father of the family smirked and threw a glance at his son, waiting to see what he would say. "Your little star is resting, sleeping like a bear in hibernation," laughed Noah to distract his mom. He treasured her madly, loved and respected her. It pained him to see the state of the one who had raised and educated him. "Do they promise that if you get sick, you'll tell one of us?" Mason asked, looking into his wife's pale face. Tanya nodded eagerly and smiled, stroking her son's and her husband's hands. Noah, satisfied that his mother's condition had normalized, hurried to his room to get some rest. Kelly spent the entire evening deciding what to wear. She wanted to look good, for Noah was indeed attracted to her. She knew a lot of people liked her, but it wasn't so easy to get her attention. Choosing a black skirt, shorts, and a top of the same color, the girl began to put on chains and rings. They harmoniously complemented her bold image. Gathering her long dark hair into a high ponytail, she looked at the time, 9:30. All that was left was to wait. 8:50, the doorbell rang, and with a good in the mirror, she ran to open it. Noah stood before her in a leather jacket, dark jeans, and with a chain on which hung a beautiful dragon pendant. It was the same one she had seen Nancy wearing. "Hey, you look beautiful," Noah said, looking the girl over from top to toe. She smiled embarrassedly and was about to step out, throwing her jacket on. "Are you going to need it?" Kelly hesitated, realizing that it was summer outside and all the jackets were left at his mother's apartment. "I don't have one here." "Is it cool outside?" the girl asked, not understanding, looking at Noah. "We're not going by car," smirked the guy and began to take off his knee. "No, you're cold. I'm going to change my clothes now. I'm going to put on some sports clothes," Kelly exclaimed, and already turned around to rush to the closet, as she was stopped by a man's hand. "You'll wear mine. Your look will fit perfectly where we're going now," Noah concluded, and the Kenyan got into the paint, quickly closing the apartment and putting on the guy's leather jacket. Kelly hurried after Noah. A black Suzuki Iron Horse was waiting for them near the entrance. Noah looked at it with pride and admiration. "Wow, you drive one of these. I thought we were going to walk," Kelly said in surprise, stepping closer to the bike. "I know how to surprise," Noah said and winked at the girl. And she only dreamed with him even more. She seemed like a little girl who had never once flirted with grown boys before, even though she was already 26. Noah gently placed the helmet on the girl and helped her buckle it on. Later, he did the same to himself, and they rushed off on their adventure. Kelly, hooked into Noah's belt, looked out at the city flying by. She'd lived here for over 10 years, but this was the first time she'd seen it like this. Noah wasn't gaining much speed, but still the adrenaline flowed into her bloodstream, tingling through her body. "Aren't you scared?" shouted Noah so the girl behind him could hear him. "Noah, it's beautiful," shouted back, and she pressed herself even tighter against the guy. He smiled and rushed towards the exit. They arrived at the same highway where they had gone for a car ride yesterday. The place was lively, a bunch of motorcycles, half-naked girls, and stripped guys that tried to appear brutal in front of a bunch of women's hearts. "We're here for the race?" asked Nilsades, jumping off the motorcycle. Several pairs of eyes nearby were immediately drawn to them. The girl immediately felt uncomfortable and turned to Noah. "I rode my first motorcycle race today," the boy said, smiling. A strange feeling overtook Kelly. She was scared. The smile fell off her face and she lowered her eyes. The blonde guy noticed the change in his friend's mood and gently circled his arm around her waist, beckoning her over to him. She was taken aback, but didn't pull away. "Don't be afraid. I'll leave you with my acquaintances. The race doesn't last that long. I'll be back quickly," Noah said and looked her straight in the eye. He was warm and gentle, and she felt safe and secure around him. The girl nodded slowly and looked at everyone present and noticed a heavy gaze on herself. The guy standing in the distance did not take his eyes off Noah and Kelly, who were almost in an embrace not far from the start. "Who's that?" the girl asked, nodding her head toward the stranger. The girl's dark-haired hand clenched sharply, and raising her head, she noticed Noah's eyes flashed with rage. "Are you okay? Maybe we should go." Off to the side stood Liam Verlaine, his cousin, and his companion with a look. He wanted to take this pretty girl away from him, just like he'd stolen the girl he no longer wanted. "That's my cousin Nancy and me." The son of the same James gave Noah away, trying to keep his temper in check. He was mostly quiet, didn't like arguments and emotional fights, but he did get into fights sometimes. When situations really got to him, Kelly squirmed involuntarily, and Noah pulled her closer to him. It was Chechen, but he wanted to show Liam that the girl came with him and would leave too. Liam disappeared from the sight of the two of them, and then the preparations for the race began. "This is Kelly. I'm leaving her with you." Jack did not let anyone near her or away from her. Noah whispered angrily, approaching his friend. Kelly said hello to her companion for the next 20 minutes and stood next to him. "He won't hurt you. Don't be afraid. We'll go for a ride after the race." He winked again. Kelly squirmed in embarrassment. "Be careful," the girl whispered, and the guy smiled. Walking away, he turned once more and gave her a warm look, letting her know he was there for her. Standing on the start line, Noah noticed with his side vision Liam, who was standing 3 bikes to the right, and grinning achidically, looking over at his brother. Noah knew that the man had been racing a motorcycle for years and that doing it would be difficult, but that was his main goal for tonight. Glancing at Kelly again, Noah assumed the ready position and waited for the girl to come out to announce the start. They flew at breakneck speed, left in the lead by only the two of them. 2 sons, 2 brothers, that warred with each other as much as they did. Noah's maneuverability was superior, but Liam's bike was superior. The finish line was close, and Noah went for an overtake. Making a big mistake, failing to control, Noah went off the track and into a ditch. Before doing so, it flipped twice. Screams echoed through the crowd, and Kelly gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "Is that Noah?" Kelly asked in a shaky voice to Jack, who was standing there in complete shock. "Say it." "Noah," shouted the race organizer and rushed to Port, who was not far away from him. Kelly's breath caught, and she stopped hearing the people around her. Her pulse raced at a breakneck speed, and her legs became absorbent cotton. She didn't know what to do, and only slowly Morgana, hoping that it was just a dream. "Eating," the doctor shouted into the organizer's mouthpiece. Kelly snapped out of her trance and looked around. Jack was no longer beside her. Noah, who was clearly unconscious, was being carried from the track in her arms. "Is there a doctor here?" She pushed through the crowd and overcame her fear, rushed to the guys who were carrying her friend. "I'm a doctor," Kelly shouted and grabbed the first aid kit from the guy who was carrying her, apparently to Noah. The same familiar Jack laid the blonde on the makeshift couch that the guys had built and stared intently into his friend's face. Kelly picked herself up and walked over to Noah, and her arm was covered in blood. Her clothes were torn, and her head was still in her helmet. "Take the helmet off," the girl muttered. Everyone around them crowded around, but apparently they didn't hear her. "Get that damn helmet off him." "I can't," she screamed. Tears were pooling in her eyes. Jack obeyed the girl and carefully removed the helmet from his friend. There was a small abrasion on his face, but his hair had shrunk to a scarlet color. Niz lifted his head and found a serious cut in the neck area. Grabbing the disinfectant, the agent began to treat the wounds, her body filled with adrenaline. She ripped the t-shirt on Noah's chest with all her might, thus causing the crowd to gasp in amazement. There was a branch sticking out somewhere in the rib area, and blood spurted from the wound beneath it, covering the guy's pale skin. "Call an ambulance," Kelly shouted. "You can't. Everyone here is illegally paddling us all. cried out the organizer standing in the front row of onlookers. But he could lose a lot of blood. No one answered, and the crowd began to thin out. There were no more than 30 people left. Kelly sighed heavily and threw off her leathers with a freak out, then pulled off her top. The guys perked up dramatically. "Keep your lust to yourself." "Pro," growled Jack, apparently remembering Noah's words. Kelly put on Jenka again, which smelled so Noah Ablayazov. Her lips dried with excitement. She held out her top to Jack and spoke. "I took a branch of dust out of his wound, and you immediately, putting it on top and pressing. But not hard, I realized." The lad nodded, and everyone also watched what was happening. "There's alcohol, strong vodka, whiskey, tequila?" Kelly asked, and some guy handed her a bottle of Jack Daniels. She nodded gratefully and opened the bottle. In a minute, she had already treated her hands and the skin around the wound. In one motion, she pulled out a branch and poured whiskey over the wound. Jack instantly followed the girl's edict and pressed down with a cloth. Bloodshed generously threaded the needle. Kelly turned to the girls again. A girl in the crowd hesitated and ran to the car. Kelly hoped that some crazy person actually had these things with them. Noah stopped abruptly, and Kelly flew to his face, looking around him. "Do you see me?" Abruptly, she asked. He nodded slowly and gravely. Kelly turned on the flashlight and started checking the guy's eyes until she saw the girl's outstretched hand with the bobbins and black needle threads. Kelly looked at it questioningly, as if asking, "Where did you get that from?" "I'm a clothing designer. Always have it with me. And apparently for good reason," she said and smiled. The smile was more frightened than sincere. Noah tried to get up, but Kelly's hand stopped him. "Lie down better." The girl pulled the long sleeve of her jacket and held it out to the boy's face. "It will hurt when it bites." He looked at the girl through his eyelashes, not understanding, and then obeyed. And she found herself undressed again in only one bra. And Jack gave everyone around him a very unkind look. The guys gulped, but stopped whispering. Jack was still holding the wound fearfully and looked at Kelly, hoping she would get his friend cleaned up soon. "Jack, can you clean up?" Kelly said firmly, as if this was a normal situation, and it wasn't the first time she'd been on the racetrack for her friend, with a regular needle and thread. Seeing the wound near her nose, she closed her lips and blinked to keep from crying. In a second, she had already pierced living flesh with the needle, and Noah jerked, sinking her teeth into the tight leather of the jacket. "Sha, it's going to be okay," whispered Kelly, continuing to sew with trembling hands. Everyone watched this as if it were a show, afraid that at one point the girl would give up. "I'm finishing up." "Noah, it's okay." The guy was pale and was fainting, probably from blood loss. Kelly finished sewing and moved closer to the guy's face. "We still have to go to the hospital. Who can take us?" Kelly said hopefully, looking out at the crowd. The girl who had helped with the thread and needle volunteered again. Jack carried Noah to the car, and Kelly, apparently recovering from the shock, began to shake, looking at her bloody hands. "You saved him," said Jack, approaching the girl. "And not yet," Kelly said through her tears, and got into the front seat of the new BMW. They drove as fast as they could, but I couldn't get away from what had happened, and the kind stranger tried to support her. When they arrived at the hospital, they called for the paramedics. "Thank you," Kelly said, turning to the stranger. "What's your name?" "Yuliana." "Thank you." Not everyone would dare to do such a thing, giving her a smile. Yuliana wished her a speedy recovery and went home. She was scared too, but not as much as the one who protected the man sitting with her knees on the bare asphalt. Kelly quickly dialed her friend's number. Red stains formed on the phone, and tears came to her throat again. "Nancy, Hospital 5. Your brother's been in an accident," the girl said, and without waiting for an answer, dropped the call. She wouldn't take questions from the twin sister of someone who was now unconscious, with multiple injuries. Kelly sat alone in the bright hallway, her eyes unsupported, swollen with tears, and blood already caked on her hands. Excitement and fear filled every cell of the girl's body, and she couldn't contain the shivering that Noah hadn't relented from the moment they got here. "Kelly," shouted Nancy, and her parents followed. "Explain." The blonde, seeing her friend's hands, burst into tears and was ready to faint. But her father managed to catch her from behind. "Where is he? What's wrong with him?" Nancy's cry echoed throughout the hospital, and a nurse looked out of the office. Dear Mother put her arm around her shoulders and sat down beside her. "We're nervous, and I guess you are too. Tell me, please," Mason said quietly, sitting down next to Kelly. "We went to the race. He was in the front with his cousin." Kelly burst out nervously. Surprise was reflected on the gray-haired man's face. "He went into a ditch," NASA continued to tell us. "He got a cut on his neck and a bunch of abrasions. A branch pierced his ribs." And then Kelly started crying. She started to cover her face with her hands, thus smearing the naked liquid around her eyes. She couldn't believe that the first guy she liked so much could die now. Nancy cried a little longer. Cindy could barely contain herself from passing out. The doctor came out of the room and looked around at those present. "Who stitched up the wound?" asked a middle-aged man dressed in a white coat. When he noticed Kelly, he immediately realized it was her and turned to her. The girl tensed nervously with the man in charge. She was afraid to hear that her action could have cost Noah his life. "If it wasn't for you, he probably wouldn't have gotten here. You did the right thing and saved that guy's life," the doctor concluded. The girl threw her head back and exhaled in relief. Mason immediately took the doctor aside to talk. "Have you been embroidering, Noah?" Nancy asked quietly, trying to regain her composure after her tantrum. Kelly nodded slowly, not even turning to her friend. "You saved his life." The blonde jumped on her friend and started kissing her, not noticing the dark scarlet streaks on her face. "You saved him," Cindy said, looking at Kelly gratefully. She nodded and clung to her friend. Mason returned and whispered something to Cindy. She took Nancy's hand, and they went into Noah's room. "Now tell me, please, which brother did you mean when you said they were in the front together?" excitedly asked Mason. Looked on. The next day, Noah was feeling better, but he was still in a hospital bed. In the hallway sat his family as well as Kelly, who was waiting for him to wake up. Molly entered the hospital with slow steps. I looked anxiously at my son and daughter-in-law. "How is he?" she asked quietly, approaching Cindy. She said something inaudible. And the old woman went over to Mason. Nancy was asleep on her friend's shoulder. Apparently, the stress had taken all the strength she could muster. "Mason," the woman said, and stroked her son's head. "Call me that." "Pro," growled Smith, and roughly threw back his mother's hand. She shook her head unhappily, but still looked at him with love and pity. "One person can come in for 5 minutes, the doctor said as he left the room. "But the patient wants to see a certain Kelly." Everyone turned to the dark-haired girl who sat still covered in blood. Nancy wiped her friend's face with wet wipes in the night. "Oh no, take note." There was still blood on her hands. She didn't get up from her seat exactly until she got to the hospital. It was like she was afraid that when she stepped away, the irreparable would happen. "Kelly doesn't want to see you," Nancy said quietly in a sleepy voice. Kelly immediately perked up, but was still trembling as she entered the room. Walking over to the hospital bed, she slowly lowered herself to the edge and looked into the guy's eyes. "Alive." "Relieved," the girl said, and a tear rolled down her tear-swollen cheeks. "Thank you," the boy replied and took her hand. "I'm sorry for putting you through this. You're alive, and that's all that matters." Kelly waved him away and smiled, strained but sincere. 3 weeks later, the accident was still being investigated by Mason, who strongly suspected his nephew Liam. Noah had already been discharged and was perfectly healthy, although he was not allowed to drive yet, which made him very angry. After the accident, Nancy met with Jacob, the very same policeman, and told him what her uncle was up to against her grandmother. They devised their plan so that they could save her grandmother and catch him, James, red-handed since there was no solid evidence to hold him. Kelly persevered in caring for her friend in the hospital, and they became noticeably closer to Noah during this time. "Do you like him?" Nancy asked with a squint, pouring tea into a mug. Kelly sat across from her and angrily colored. "I've liked him exactly from the moment I saw him. What are we even talking about?" The friends laughed and continued chatting. Nancy was still worried about the situation with her grandmother and occasionally called Jacob, who had introduced the task force to Molly's house. She needed to make sure her grandmother was going to be okay. "Would you do it again?" James said in a gruff tone, glaring at his son. "What if they realize?" Liam asked fearfully, shifting from foot to foot. "You're going to solve the dam breaks now. Otherwise, you'll never see the company again," shouted James, and Charles entered the office. "You have no right to blackmail him." "Father." The older son's tone embarrassed James, and he shifted his stern gaze to him. "You dare to cross me. You will not blackmail my brother. Remember that," Charles said firmly, and almost walked out of the study, hoping that his father would stop doing that to his younger son. But then Liam's voice rang out. "I'll do it, Father." And Charles realized that he was only doing it to spite him. He got behind the wheel. A few days later, Noah went to ICE, where Nancy and Jacob were already gathered. It was some kind of secret place where they were discussing the grandmother's case. He parked in his usual spot and headed for the driveway. The door was opened by a blue-eyed beauty that was already looking at Noah with a loving gaze. He winked at her and later meekly left her cheek and made his way inside the apartment. The four of the guys discussed Uncle James first and later started chatting about various topics. Kelly and Noah noticed some sort of invisible connection between Nancy and Jacob, but were only observing for now, not drawing conclusions. The girls began to prepare dinner. Noah watched Kelly, and Jacob glanced glumly out the window. After a moment, he pulled out his phone and started filming something until Nancy noticed him. Guessed the girl stepped closer to the brunette. "Are you okay? Something about work? If you're gone, after Molly dies, will everything officially go to James?" Jacob asked, not taking his eyes off the fire. Nancy and Noah looked at each other in surprise. Kelly looked shocked. "Well, probably," Nancy replied warily. "Why do you ask? We can only put your damn brother in jail and disinherit James if your father isn't in on it with him," Jacob concluded, reviewing some kind of video on his phone. "And they're against each other. They can't be on the same side." Nancy gave it away, supposedly to stand up for her father. She couldn't stand his inhibitions, but she loved him nonetheless. Jacob disapproved, glanced at Kelly, and Noah tensed. But the tension went away quickly, and Jacob hurriedly went outside to call someone. 20 minutes later, he returned and hurried the guys out, asking Kelly to stay home. "Cindy, this is not normal. You lost 10 pounds in the last week," Mason exclaimed, pacing from side to side. "Are you sick?" "I'm fine." "What are you talking about?" Smiling tiredly, the woman said, and lay down on the couch. She rarely had dinner with her family lately and spent more and more time in bed. The phone rang and Mason picked up the receiver, answering in an irritated voice. Smith listened. The man's hand dropped, and the phone collapsed to the floor. Eyes on Kud and her legs gave out, causing Cindy to jump up from her seat and walk over to her husband. Though she was dizzy herself, "Indivisible mine," the man issued, folding the lump that had formed in his throat. "Cindy, our babies." The blonde brought her eyebrows together at the bridge of her nose and turned her spouse's face toward her with a cold palm. "Mason, what Noah?" Cindy asked in a shaky voice, realizing that the look on her husband's face didn't bode well. "Our children are dead," Mason said questioningly, as if asking his wife if it was true. "Mason," Cindy whispered and staggered, and then fell into her husband's arms as well. Websites and channels were filled with news of Smith's death. There was a terrible accident outside of town today that killed the heirs to Smith Mason, known as the perfect twins Nancy and Noah Smith, born in 1990. At this point, it is known that after the brakes failed, the car flew into a ditch and caught fire. The bodies have been taken away for identification and other details are being established. Cindy was immediately admitted to the intensive care unit after this news and was found to have the last stage of leukemia. Mason, identified with the children, became depressed, and Kelly stopped leaving the house. Even weeks after the funeral, Jacob visited occasionally to support her, but it did not help her at all. The pain and mourning affected absolutely everyone except James Smith's family. It was as if he was rejoicing in his victory, that he'd finally gotten rid of his longtime rival. Gasps, "Dad, I dream about them," Liam said quietly as he approached his father. He had been awake for the last 3 o'clock, and he looked bad. Black circles under his eyes, dried lips and dark hollows above his puckered ones. "Don't whine like a boy. You did the right thing. You wanted a place in the company, and you got it," James said sternly and asked his son to leave his office. "You did the right thing." The young man's hands trembled, and his eyes showed fear. He was haunted by echoes of the time he had ruthlessly cut the brake cable in his cousin's car, after which he had burned almost alive in the same car. "If your uncle finds out, die." Liam, covering his face with his hands. He was really scared. "I thought we were only trying to maim them, like in a race." "You faltered then," and he ran out behind his girlfriend. "Don't beat yourself up," James concluded and patted his son on the shoulder. Liam walked out of his father's office on woozy legs and still didn't realize that he had killed 2 people with his own hands. He slowly made his way to his brother's room and knocked quietly. "Come in." His tone was still cold and detached. Liam entered and quietly sat down on the bed. Charles looked at his brother in surprise and crossed his fingers on his stomach as he lay in bed. "I've done something stupid," Liam said, and looked into his brother's eyes, hoping for his support. "Tell me, am I terrible? You've only become your father's puppet. I don't blame you for craving attention from that freak," Charles said firmly and rose to embrace his brother. They both felt each other's warmth, as if after a long separation. "I have always loved you and will always love you, brother. Stop being what you are now. Your real side is much better." There was a knock on the front door. "Superintendent Marlowe. Smith Liam lives here." Kelly sat in her room and occasionally came out to get a drink of water. She did. Over the past week, her skin had grown pale, lost its healthy luster, and her eyes had faded and seemed to be gone forever. It was the first time she'd ever loved so much. Then she'd almost lost it at the race, and now it was truly dead. Losing her best friend was just as painful as losing her lover. At first she hadn't believed it, saying it couldn't be, that he wasn't the one who was supposed to die. Her body filled with unbearable pain. Her heart clenched and her breathing was interrupted so badly that she wanted to die herself. No one held her back at the funeral, and she literally flooded Noah and Nancy's coffin with tears. There was a barely audible knock on the door, and for some reason Kelly remembered Noah knocking quietly. She jumped up and almost fell over. She was getting very dizzy from malnutrition. "Jacob was lost," Kelly said, looking at her friend through the veil of tears in her eyes. "I was so excited to see Noah here." The boy stepped inside and pulled his friend against him. She sobbed, bumping Jacob's nose into his chest, soaking his white shirt with her tears. "We found the person responsible for the accident. Liam will go to jail soon," Jacob issued, and at some point, something clicked in the girl's mind. She wished the guilty would pay and pay all over the world. "It's their brother, isn't it? I'm sure he set that up at that race too," Kelly said, wiping the tears from her boot-red cheeks. She looked lifeless, as if her soul had gone out of her and only a shell remained. Jacob nodded and took a seat at the table. He was flustered, but he was also trying to keep his cool. He's a cop, and it's inherent in him to deceive those he'd rather not deceive. Cindy Sunshine didn't want to go to the hospital for some reason, Mason asked, looking at his wife with empty blue eyes. He sat for days at the grave of his own children, and now he sits by the hospital bed of his already dying wife. "I've lost everything." My angels are gone. Repeated nonstop every day. Cindy stared at the white ceiling. The doctors said that in addition to leukemia, she had a very delicate psyche, and after the death of her children, it was unlikely that she would be able to become what she was. Unless, of course, she lives longer than a month. Don't leave me, I'm all alone. Beloved, don't leave Snow White. Mason smiled strangely and took his wife's cold, pale hand. He called her Snow White. In their not-too-distant youth, she had indeed had fair, radiant skin that beckoned to be touched. I love you. I've lost everything. My angels are gone. Cindy whispered again and fell into a deep sleep. Mason waved away a tear and rubbed his face with his hands, trying to bring himself to his senses. He walked out of the room, pulling his cell phone out of his pocket. James is doing his thing. I'll help with the mother, and you give me my 20%. I have nothing more to lose, Smith stated and dropped the call. Molly sat in her living room and slowly sipped her tea, occasionally turning around at the door. She had lost her husband and 2 grandchildren, and it had taken its toll on her. She cried a lot after the funeral of the twins. It's hard to lose those one is supposed to protect. She had to leave this world before the 2 blonde-haired angels that had loved Grandma so much. Footsteps sounded in the house, and the old woman turned around. James. Mason raised his eyebrows in surprise, Molly said, delighted by the children's unexpected visit. Have you decided to visit me? Almost, Monty, James said, and grinned. He'd somehow kept his brother in the dark about the fact that his son had been taken to the police this morning on suspicion of attempted murder. In one motion, James held a handkerchief soaked in sleeping pills to his mother's face, and Mason turned away grudgingly, as if he didn't want to see his mother relieved. In his brother's hands, "Father would never forgive us," he said, glaring at James. "Good thing he can't see it," smirked Smith Jr. and beckoned to the guy standing outside the door. He grabbed the old woman's hands carelessly and dragged her to the car. She lives on the outskirts of town, not far from the woods. Let's just say she's always out walking in the evenings. And oh my God, James feigned surprise. She just got lost and was torn apart by wolves. You're a freak, Mason said. You should be glad I'm social. Otherwise I'd feel sorry for my mother. They drove in a black-tinted car with no license plates, while their mother lay in the trunk without any signs of life, stopped near a forest that stretched for many more kilometers. The subordinate James threw the old lady right out onto the ground. She moaned, but was still unconscious at the same time. Next, we go into the house ourselves and collect any evidence we can. Wipe the floor. No one can know we were at our mother's house, James said menacingly and grabbed his mother's hand. Mason followed suit and grabbed the other one. The boy nodded and got into the car, started the engine and squealed away. 2 brothers were dragging their own mother into the woods to her death. At one point she came to her senses and turned around to see the faces of her captors. Was it because of the inheritance? Almost crying, Molly spoke, raising her head at James. You even made your brother do this to me. There was a sharp pop, and the old woman passed out again. James rubbed the palm of his hand that had slapped his mother, and they continued into the depths of the woods, dumping her near a tree. Mason looked at his mother with regret, and then his head as if he wanted to convince himself that this was the way it should be. They began to move away from the place where they had left their mother. She was crying and moaning from the pain that stiffened her body, and not far away came the howling of wild animals. And a chill went down Molly's body, and she froze. And then she saw 2 people. They came down from heaven like angels. The guy knelt down in front of her and stroked her swollen wrinkles. The detectives. Hush, he whispered, and Molly finally lost consciousness. Quiet footsteps behind him. James heard and froze in place. Mason, do you hear the wolves? He asked his older brother, moving closer to him. He was a coward, and it showed. Hands up. You're under arrest for kidnapping and grievous bodily harm. Friends. There was a call. Jacob's voice was behind Mason's back. Marlowe grinned at how coolly he had planned the Smith brothers' arrest. He had only pointed the gun at Smith Sr. and James, noticing this, had rushed to escape. "Not so fast," Uncle whispered in a woman's caustic voice. James stumbled and fell. Turning around, he couldn't believe his eyes. Standing behind him was Nancy, a living, healthy Nancy holding a gun. "You thought you'd get rid of us with your pathetic son, and then get Granny out of the way." Nancy. Mason moved toward his daughter, but she pointed the gun at him. Noah appeared from behind, holding the barely standing grandmother. She was crying and thanking all the gods for her rescue. "Son," Smith Sr. spoke again. Tears sprang from his eyes. He dropped his knees to the ground and couldn't believe what was happening. "Nancy and I believed until the last moment that you were innocent." "Daddy," Noah said in a hoarse, trembling voice, "you're the most despicable thing that could have happened to us. After our uncle, of course. I'll make you suffer the way you made Grandma suffer," Nancy issued, clutching the gun in her hand more confidently. Jacob shook his head disapprovingly, and she angrily but still lowered the weapon. "You have nowhere to run. You are under arrest," Jacob stated and handcuffed both defendants. Jacob's game had started back in the day when he had filmed Liam cutting the brake cable on Noah's car from his apartment window, and he had called his coworkers and asked them to come in the driveway. Once Nancy and Noah came out, he had them change into their coworkers' clothes and, conversely, put them in the work car. He instructed his subordinates to fake an accident and plant a body from the last cottage fire that more or less resembled Nancy and Noah. It was a complicated operation, but Jacob executed it perfectly. He wanted to catch Smith Sr. He knew he had a criminal record, but he couldn't prove it yet. And to do that, he needed to put a void in his soul. That's what he did when he forced him to bury his own children. Nancy and Noah headed to the hospital to see their mother, but unfortunately they didn't make it in time. She had died 10 minutes before they arrived, and the press outside the clinic had time to snap pictures of the perfect twins, which only fueled the news feeds and channels in town. The two twins roared into each other's shoulder as they learned of their mother's death. They couldn't forgive themselves for her spending those hard days without them, thinking that her children had left her alone. Nancy bit her fists until they bled, trying to calm herself down, but all in vain. Her father, uncle, and cousin were behind bars. Her grandmother was in serious condition, and her mother was already dead. She could not bear all the pain that had come over her on this truly difficult day. They cried over their mother's body for a long time until she was taken to the morgue. There was no end to the suffering, and to feel a little bit of joy, the twins went to Casey's house so she could hug them again and believe they were alive. The door swung open, and Noah looked fearfully at the girl he had come to love so much. Hollows instead of eyes, a lost look of thinness, a body careless of hair and heavy breathing. "Noah," she said quietly. "Nancy, I need to start eating, or my hallucinations will get even earlier." Her legs jerked up, and Noah managed to catch her as she fell unconscious right in his arms. Her last words sounded scary. "I want to go after you so badly, Noah." They laid their friend on the bed. The room was in chaos, piles of sedative wrappers, water bottles, things. Everything was scattered, but not a single clue as to what she had eaten. Nancy, finding some ammonia in her friend's first aid kit, put Vyatka up to Kelly's nose, and somewhat awake, Sonny whispered softly to Nancy, trying to hold back tears. Noah sat motionless next to the girl, wrapping his arm around her palm with his hand. Nancy sighed heavily to Kelly, and then shifted her gaze to Noah. "Am I in heaven?" "We're alive. We'll explain everything to you. Just don't be nervous," the guy said in a hoarse voice. He was still in shock at what was happening, and the state of his lover drove him even more. 10 minutes later, and bald eyes were burning with fire, as she kissed Noah's face relentlessly. Sitting on his lap, she couldn't stop savoring his touch, and the scent she dreaded never to hear his hair again, whether to tickle her stroking neck as he hugged her tightly. In the meantime, Nancy would call Jacob and find out how things were going with her father and the rest of her relatives. "I missed you so much. I was so scared. I was so scared," whispered Kelly somewhere in the dimples of her collarbone as she snuggled against Noah. "You're the only thing I have besides my mom. I wanted you to be aware so you wouldn't have to go through what you've already been through." But Jacob said it was for the best, Noah said guiltily and stroked the girl's tangled hair. "Come on, you need a shower, and I'll order you something to eat. You don't look well, love." Something inside Kelly came to life. She flushed with color when the guy called her favorite. She jumped up cheerfully, but immediately grabbed her head. The dizziness was getting worse. "You do realize that if you keep quiet, you'll get a lot more than planned," Jacob said in a stern tone, alone with Mason Smith in the interrogation room. "I had nothing to do with anything they are hanging on me now," the man said confidently and raised his chin proudly. "Didn't you take your mother into the woods with your brother?" Jacob smirked, leaning back in his chair. "You made me bury my children who turned out to be alive only to put me behind bars. I bet you want to finish your father's job, don't you?" Mason gritted his teeth and smiled cheekily and imperiously. He was right. Jacob has long pursued the goal of getting rid of the overbearing Smith family, just as his late father, Police Captain Marlo Sam, wanted him to. Because of Nancy and Noah's father, Jacob's father died, and he felt obligated to punish him for it. "You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can be used against you," Marlo said and smiled evasively again. A month later, she lowered her head quietly onto her brother's shoulder and waited for the verdict. Her palms were sweating, and she nervously clutched the hem of her skirt for what only looked like morning. Across from her sat Charles, shaking his tonic shoes with a disgruntled look. He tried to keep his mask of being a cold, stern, and emotionless guy. And if he didn't care at all about his father's fate, he was clearly nervous about Liam's sentence. "How'd it go?" Jumping up from his seat, Nancy asked as Jacob approached them. "The three of them will all sit far and wide for a long time," Jacob concluded and turned to Dimitri. "I hope you're smarter than your relatives. If you have plans to make your children put me in jail too, don't even think about it." Nervously, Charles said again and hurried out of the corridor. After her mother's death, everything that was her real estate went to Nancy, and the chattels to Noah. Cindy died with an agonizing pain in her heart, never knowing that her children were actually alive. It still tears the twins' hearts apart, and they still grieve, but try to hold on for the sake of the future. Everything the Smith brothers owned was confiscated by their court. They were extremely lucky that the company was still owned by their grandmother, and the family didn't lose it. Noah and Nancy made a pact with Charles that the entire company would go to him, even if Grandma decided to divide it all between the grandchildren. The twins finally decided that they didn't need the business and wanted to pursue creative endeavors and anything else their souls desired. The house remains in their possession, as it is Cindy's property. "I don't know how to feel. We have won justice, but how will I be without my father and mother lost?" asked Nancy, and looked at Kostya, while Noah called Nancy too. "You have Noah Kelly." He glanced nervously at who. That formed in his throat, "And you have me." Nancy raised her eyebrows in surprise and smiled warmly, placing her palms on Jacob's shoulders. She moved closer to him. "Does that mean you're asking me out?" With a sneer, she asked. "I thought you were already mine." Smiling, Jacob joked and kissed the girl on the forehead. "You are brave, beautiful, confident. I want to be with you, despite your family's misdeeds in the past." Yes, he had told the twins about his father's death, and he in no way blamed Nancy or Noah for it. He knew it was all their dishonorable father's fault. "Let's take Kelly and go to Grandma's with the four of us. She's feeling better, and I don't think she'd mind the company," Noah said, rising from his chair. Jacob and Nancy nodded. After waiting for Fader to do his business, they picked up Kelly and headed for that very out-of-the-way spot near the woods. The twins' minds were spinning with questions they wanted to ask their grandmother, but were worried about her health. "Hi, Grandma," said Nancy, hugging the old lady. She led everyone to the table, where freshly baked pies and waddles were already on the table. "This is Kelly, my best friend, and Noah's girlfriend," said Nancy, smiling broadly. She was insanely happy about this bond between brother and girlfriend, and these two people closest to her were happier together than ever. "Future wife," and actually corrected Noah. Everyone laughed amicably, and Kelly smacked his elbow in his side in embarrassment. "It's Jacob. You probably remember him, don't you? He's a police officer." Nancy steeled herself and continued, "And part-time boyfriend of mine." Grandma smiled genuinely and took a seat at the table as she put the kettle on the stove. "And you guys are so happy." She stroked Nancy and Kelly's hands. "I remember when Mason and James first brought Cindy and Benjamin to meet them." The young couple stared at Grandma, and Nancy and Noah wondered where Charles and Liam's mother had gone since they were little. "Grandma, tell us about them when they were young. We've already lost Mom." Nancy folded nervously, suppressing the tears that came to her throat. "And Benjamin, we didn't know at all. But listen," Molly grinned and began her story. "James was the first to show me his daughter-in-law. He was more malleable, always trying to please his father when he was young, wanting his praise and not to give it to Mason. He'd been prejudiced against me since I was a teenager. He thought I was overprotective of my adult son, even though he was barely 13 at the time. I loved them equally, but they both fought for their father's love, not mine." Kelly heard the whistle of the kettle, and without interrupting her grandmother, stood up and began pouring tea into mugs. Benjamin he brought in his 22 years, and she was very beautiful, tall, with long black hair and innocent green eyes. Charles was starting to look a lot like her now, just as cold, but at the same time attractive and admirable as his mother. She and I hit it off almost immediately, but for some reason unknown to me, James kept her away from me. She treated me lovingly when they visited occasionally. I still remember her sweet vanilla scent. I remember it too. The bassist blared, and the tone, and everyone at the table turned their heads toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was Charles. His eyes were filled with tears, but he held his head proudly. Grandma cried out and rushed towards Charles. The same hugged the grandmother so tightly that it seemed her Jacob was about to burst. "I missed you," Charles said quietly, so that only Grandma could hear. "And Mom too." She patted him on the shoulder and invited him to the table. No one objected. "Benjamin was a real angel to James, and he probably blames me for her death," Grandmother said, lowering her head guiltily. "Why?" Kelly asked with interest. She cast an understanding glance at Charles, who was trying to keep himself from crying. "When she got pregnant with Liam, the doctor said that if she gave birth, she might die. Both Benjamin and I were the only ones who believed in a miracle that never happened. James couldn't forgive me for siding with his wife and letting her die in childbirth." A tear rolled down his cheek, and Charles carefully waved it away from his grandmother's face. He really did love her, but apparently he hadn't known how to show it before. Was that why Liam had become the object of his uncle's hatred? Nancy asked. Charles wrinkled his nose. "Yes," said the oldest of the Smith brothers firmly. That was why he considered grandmother and Liam to be the fault of no one else. Nancy's chest stabbed treacherously. She didn't know they had such a sad family history because her father and mother had always forbidden discussing the James family. "Do you know why Mom disliked Father Charles and Liam so much?" Noah asked, drinking his second cup of tea, which Kelly was kindly handing out. She felt as if she were sitting with the people closest to her, and she loved him. Charles said, answering for his grandmother. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. "How do you know?" Molly asked. She patted her grandson on the shoulder. "James told you." "I figured it out." Nancy and Noel looked at each other, but did not interfere and waited for the story to continue. Cindy and James were in the same year at university. She'd been chasing him for a long time, and he'd sort of reciprocated. Mason at the time had already graduated and was busy with business. James might have married her if he hadn't met Benjamin, who drove him crazy, in his third year. Cindy suffered for a long time, trying to get James' attention, and soon she learned that he had an older brother. At first, she wanted her lover to be jealous of Mason, and then Mason fell head over heels in love with Cindy. Grandma took a drink of tea and looked around at everyone present. They listened with interest to the story of their parents when they were young. James paid no attention to her, and when Mason brought her in as a daughter-in-law, I could tell by the looks in their eyes what Cindy wanted. I decided it wasn't worth hiding it from Mason and told him everything. He didn't believe it and said I just didn't want his happiness. From that time on, Mason stopped calling me mother and stopped thinking of me as a mother at all. The old woman's eyes brimmed with tears, and she couldn't stand it any longer and started crying. I just wanted my children to be happy. That's what they did to me. The grandchildren and Jacob leaned over their grandmother and cradled her as best they could. She cried and hugged her grandchildren, hoping that they would stay with her for the rest of her life, that they would not abandon her like her sons had done. We are not our fathers. We love you and appreciate you, Noah said, and Charles and Nancy confirmed, nodding. And in fact, we're going to take you to live at our house. There's plenty of room, and we won't be so lonely. You can also move in with me, Grandmother, Charles said, and looked at the old woman with understanding. I'm alone, and you. He stopped talking abruptly. You loved my mother so much. You are the only reminder of her. Nancy could not contain herself and tears rolled down her cheeks. She walked over to her cousin and hugged him. I'm sorry we weren't close, she said in a whisper. It's not your fault, Stargirl, Charles said. And Nancy was taken aback. Only her mother called her that. Charles understood the look in her eyes and went on. When you were little, I was often left to play with you, while my mother was still alive when she was pregnant with Lung, so you don't quite remember her. Noah was quiet, so he didn't require much attention. But here you were, Charles, grinning and looking at Nancy. With such warmth and love. You were always crying and missing your mommy. I found a star in my toys that Michaela had in different colors and gave it to you. You looked at it for a long time, and then you smiled and stopped crying. Charles was still looking at his little sister. I always wanted to be near you, but our parents were unbearable. You're the one who gave me that star I played with until I was 15. Nancy smiled and looked at Charles admiringly. You're incredible. It was such a pleasant evening, filled with bitter truths and happy memories from the past. Charles felt cozy in this atmosphere and didn't seem so cold anymore. Grandmother said that Benjamin also lowered her barrier only when she trusted and was ready to open up, and that rarely happened. Cindy, on the other hand, always held her head high and never let anyone doubt her. After a while, Charles and Grandma moved into Nancy and Noah's mansion, creating their own perfect family. Noah had also made Sophia a proposal, and they waited for the moment when they could finally consummate their marriage. I don't like talking, shouted Charles from the bathroom as he cleaned himself up before breakfast. I want plain scrambled eggs. My dear, are you going to order at the restaurant? Senya snapped cheerfully, standing at the stove in the Smith mansion. She was teasing Charles so easily and casually that they seemed to be more than acquaintances, already long-established friends. I baked the waddles, Grandma said, laying out her work of art sporting a sliced plate. You like them, don't you? We do. The twins both gave out in one voice, walking into the kitchen, camo and bacon, shouted Kelly, so she would know how to cook. Charles answered me, coming out of the bathroom, and Noah said to me, walking up to the girl, he put his arm around her waist and kissed her temple gently. Me too, came a familiar voice. Nancy turned around. Jacob stood in the doorway with a large bouquet of flowers. I didn't interrupt your family idyll. You're just in time, the blonde said, and kissed the guy on the lips, pulling him behind her neck. You, sputtered Charles and smiled. You do, because you're the only loner here. Laughed Noah. Well, except for Grandma. The room filled with laughter and joy. They thought there were no such thing as happy families, and had been living their dreams until they were all together under one roof at home. Nancy, that dreamed of being an artist or designer, who thought she would someday have to surrender into her father's hands and carry on his business, has become free. She is doing what she loves the one who loves her, and is with the people closest to her. Being perky and confident, she became softer around Jacob, for he was a man willing to do anything for her. Noah, who was quiet and calm, and dreamed of speed and adrenaline, he became what he wanted to be. He became a car guy and found his adrenaline in the one who gives it to him. Kelly glows around him, and he lets her be loved and feel safe. Charles, what tried so long and carefully to hide his feelings and emotions, has finally found a loving family where there is no tyrant father. There is a brother and sister who appreciate and love him. He sometimes longed for Liam, even cried, blames himself for not being able to protect him from their jerk father's nefarious plans, but there is nothing to fix. Liam had chosen his path, which had led him into the abyss. Molly was feeling better than ever. She was happy that her grandchildren were happy, but sad that her children had never been able to accept her desire to make them happy. "Are you sorry?" quietly asked Charles, while on a visit with his brother Liam, and in the prison colony. "I regret not being like you, cold and emotional. Then I wouldn't have felt the pain that my father had caused me all those years ago," Liam said guiltily. His lip was split, and there was a huge bruise under his eye. "I miss you, brother." "I miss you too, Liam." Charles' eyes filled with tears. "I want you to live with us so badly, to feel the warmth that I feel now. I only became alive when I got rid of my father, and I can never get rid of him," Liam replied. "It's like he's gotten into my brain under my skin. I see his eyes everywhere. I want to hear his approval. I want to know he's proud of me." Liam was already shaking with nerves, but he tried to hold on. "Forget it. You'll be out in a few years, and I'll be there for you. You're my brother, and I won't leave you," Charles said, and gave his brother a warm look. He left the visiting room. That's how it is when you live your life without thinking about how good or bad things can be. Beyond the boundaries of your thoughts, some are released and get into trouble, and some are held hostage and left to rot alive. And there are those who choose comfort and joy, and they become happy by crossing borders. "Did I really live to see my great-grandchildren?" laughed Molly, looking at the two wonderful babies that lay in the crib, quite identical, Leo and Leon, two twins. "You gave birth to beautiful babies." And my dear Molly hugged Iniesta by the shoulders and kissed him on the cheek. "You are one of the reasons for my happiness." "Who's the little one?" Charles entered the room, leaned over her nephews. "Kelly, congratulations. It's a miracle." A tall, fair-skinned girl with long dark hair and green eyes entered the room behind Charles. Molly couldn't believe her eyes and slowly approached the girl. "Benjamin," tearfully spoke the old woman, stroking the young woman on the cheek. The girl did not send Liam, smiled. "I am Charles' girlfriend." Her eyes sparkled with happiness, and her smile stretched so wide that she threatened to tear her face. "Yes, Grandma. I'd like you to meet me. It's a phenomenon." He turned to the brunette. "And this is my favorite grandma, Molly. She looks so much like Benjamin, Charles," said the old lady and fixed her gaze on her grandson. "Did you find the one you were looking for? Well, take care of her." The man nodded gratefully and took his girlfriend under his arm and led her to meet the rest of the family. Noah consulted peacefully on the couch after his extravaganza celebrating the birth of his sons. Jacob helped set the table for Nancy and Grandma and keeping an eye on the little ones. 7 years old, Charles said, and drew 2 pairs of eyes. "This is the Smirnoff family, my girlfriend and future bride," said the boy, and the blue poured out in paint. "Nice to meet you. I'm Nancy, Charles's little sister and twin to this splinter right here," smirked the blonde, pointing her finger at her unconscious brother. "This is my husband, Jacob." "Nice to meet you," Eugenia said firmly. "I'm glad Charles has such a large and happy family. I hope you will be a part of it." Nancy replied with a warm smile. "Come on, let's go help me chat, girls." Jacob walked over to his not favorite in the Smith family and looked in his wife's direction. "Now will you finally stop being ugly and become white and fluffy?" asked Marlo with a laugh at Charles. "As long as there's a policeman in our house, I'll be that freak," Smith said, and they both laughed angrily. In fact, Charles and Jacob got along quite well. Some evenings they would sit on the terrace and, sipping whiskey, chat about common topics. After Charles had solved all the illegal issues in the family company, Jacob began to treat him with more respect, but they often teased each other, feigning a fake dislike. "Does she really fit your mother's description?" "Well, according to Grandma's stories, of course," Jacob said, scrutinizing her blue face. "She came down to me from heaven like an angel. I almost ran her over in the parking lot outside the business center." Charles smiled. "Couldn't get past a woman who looked so much like my mother. It's fate." Smith. Noah jumped up from the couch and approached the men. They turned away from him unhappily. It was Noah who was burned out. "Stay away from the twins for at least a couple hours." Charles smirked. "Better yet, don't come near any of us." Laughter echoed through the living room, and the girls who had been witching in the kitchen turned sharply. "If you're having fun, I'm going to make you chop vegetables for salad now," muttered Nancy, and the men looked at her jokingly, resentfully. "Don't look at me so I'm mean." "What's the matter?" Jacob asked fearfully. "You're worried about Sam. It's a girl, and her name will be Cindy. When are you going to remember?" Nancy shouted and put her hand on her already bulging belly. She was 5 months pregnant, and she and Jacob had decided not to find out the sex of the baby until after it was born. That was why they were constantly at odds with each other. Jacob wanted to name his son after his father, and Nancy wanted to name her daughter after the mother she loved so much. And anyway, the only thing that bothers me here is you kicked the blonde out and turned her back on her husband. "Well, sunshine," Jacob muttered and moved toward his wife. "What a heel," laughed Noah, and behind his back immediately sounded a ringing shout. "Noah, if you do not wake up from your hibernation now, I will do something to you." Kelly came out into the living room, followed by Molly, smiling, wide-eyed. "I'm up," Noah exclaimed, moving toward his wife. What was standing in the doorway? "You're the only heel here," Charles whispered in Noah's ear, and he shook his head unhappily. "You said something, Charles." Cynthia came up behind him and put a hand on his shoulder. "You shouldn't call names." And the living room rang again. Laughter, sound, happiness, joy, and contentment. They had achieved a happy ending. "Now you can die," Molly said quietly under her breath and hurried off to her grandchildren.